Good morning, Dawg Nation. I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. I essentially just did this same spiel for some of our video audience, so I won't do the whole thing here right now. We normally do a little comments prior to the show where we kind of chit-chat here a little bit. A little technical stuff prevented us from doing that today, so let me not repeat myself too much and instead tell you. It's Mike Bobo talk today. We promised you we'd get there. More details about Carson Beck. These are interesting. Leads to a pretty, compelling discussion about kind of what's left over for UGA offensively and how exactly we should view Carson Beck's time here at Georgia. Dawg's got a big basketball win. We'll talk more about that. Jon Stinchcomb joins us too. A lot of fun. We're glad you're with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So we promised we would do this eventually. Today feels like a pretty good day to do it. Exactly how should we view Georgia offensive coordinator Mike Bobo's role in some offensive issues that we perceive Georgia would have had this past year? Now, let me start this way. You know, I said a few days ago that in having this discussion, obviously I don't view myself to be as, I guess probably as critical of Mike Bobo as some of you are, as kind of anti-Bobo as some of you are, but I do recognize there is a large contingent of Georgia fans that do put a lot of the blame on why Georgia finished the season below its expectations in terms of how it started the year. There are a lot of people who put a lot of that blame on the Georgia offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo. And even if I don't fully, I guess, match that opinion or match the intensity, certainly of that opinion, I do think when the numbers are as large as they are, when you see as much of a kind of, large grouping within our comment section or on social media or wherever else fans gather, when you see this going on as much as it is, I don't think you can help but, if you try to be a show that reflects the feeling of fans, I think at some point in time you sort of got to take that head on here a little bit. So I want to try to be as fair as I can be to those who kind of see a little bit of an issue with the Georgia offense and kind of coinciding some of that, if that's a word, sort of tying some of that together with kind of the Mike Bobo tenure here. Let me start with this. If you sort of feel like this year the Georgia offense wasn't everything it could have been or everything it needs to be, there is evidence that backs you up on all of that. Georgia this year was just 40th in America in yards per pass attempt. Obviously, Carson Beck was the starting quarterback. He threw most of those passes. But the Georgia passing offense overall, just 40th in America at 7.7 yards per attempt. That is certainly not elite. However, it's better than the Georgia rushing stats. If we would say the passing stats were not elite, the Georgia rushing stats this year were frankly pretty abysmal. Georgia was 84th in America in yards per rush attempt at just 4.06. So to summarize here, 40th in America in yards per pass attempt, 84th in America in yards per rush attempt. That is not good at all, and you don't need for me to tell you that. You already know. And it's perhaps not surprising that all of this adds together to an offense that's not scoring anywhere near as many points as it had been scoring. Georgia averaged more than 40 points per game in both 2022 and 2023. The only team in America, in addition to USC, just two teams in America were 40-plus points per game in both 2022 and 2023. But Georgia regressed mightily here this past season, just 38th in America at 31.5 points per game. So scoring offense, not elite, only 38th best. Passing offense, not elite, just 40th in America at yards per attempt. Rushing offense, downright bad, 84th in yards per rush. That is a pretty disappointing collection of pretty strong leading indicator offensive stats for Georgia here this year. Now, the caveat to that is that Georgia did play a much tougher schedule than it's ever played before, and so therefore perhaps there is some expectation for offensive aggression based on the sort of defense you're playing, the kind of games you're forced to play. So I think if you want to get into the more analytical advanced stats part of all this, instead of some of these sort of basic counting stats, there would be some account given for who Georgia was playing in comparison to the other teams it's being ranked along with, who those teams are playing. But to keep it simple here, we're just going to look at some of the basic numbers. Those numbers are obviously not very impressive at all. To make matters worse, when you look at some of the big games for Georgia, the postseason games here, you see even more kind of regression compared to where things were when Todd Monken was here. When Todd Monken was here in his last year at Georgia, think about postseason games. Back then, there were just three: an SEC championship, a national semifinal game, and a national championship. And in that SEC championship in 2022, Georgia scored 50 points. Now, one of those was a punt return, or I should say a punt block, but nonetheless, 50 points against LSU, 40-plus points against Ohio State, and 65 points against TCU. By comparison, in sort of three similar postseason games for Mike Bobo, a couple of SEC championships, including one in 2023, and a playoff game this year against Notre Dame, it's just 10 points this year against the Fighting Irish, 22 points in a win in overtime against Texas, and 24 points last year against Alabama. That if you want to kind of sort of zero in on where I think the Georgia offense has had its biggest issues under Mike Bobo in comparison to the Todd Monken era, it's those big games where the Monken offenses always seem to be at their best, whereas the Georgia offenses are perhaps performing even worse in some of those big games they have during the season. That's the issue that seems to exist. And in starting this conversation today, I think we want to be as fair as we can to those who feel like they see a problem. That if you're one of those people that does seem to see a problem with the Mike Bobo offense at Georgia, there is ample statistical evidence to back up your point of view that things offensively for Georgia are not as good as they used to be. Now, last week we told you we had asked some of our former players that join us, like Jake Fromm, like Davin Bellamy, what they thought about Mike Bobo. And despite some of those stats I just mentioned, both Fromm and Bellamy both supported Mike Bobo. They did not criticize Bobo to the same level that some of you do. We're going to ask Jon Stinchcomb about this when he joins us here in a little bit, too, to give him a chance to share his thoughts on all of this. However, even though both Davin and Jake, two guys we asked about this last week, are largely very supportive of Mike Bobo, especially with some of the commentary of Jake Fromm, really a believer that Bobo can be a great architect of the offense for Georgia. Even in the midst of that, the one thing that Jake did acknowledge is what I just referenced a moment ago, that some of the issues for Bobo kind of come in contrast to the guy that was here before him, Todd Monken. This is the way that Jake Fromm spoke about that last week.
I really like Coach Bobo, love his dad. I think Coach Bobo is a great offensive coordinator. I think the toughest thing for him being put in this position is he is compared to Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator. Man, and I think Coach Monken is a brilliant offensive coordinator, a fantastic play caller. Not only did he do it at UGA, but he's doing it right now at the NFL for the Ravens, and the offensive stats that they're putting up are unbelievable. So it's really tough for Coach Bobo because he's getting compared to Coach Monken, who's coming off a great kind of college career there at UGA, and he's doing it again there in the NFL. But man, I really do. I like Coach Bobo. I think they have the right pieces there. And I think that they could just get the little things. They're so close. They were so close to being a very explosive offense. A few drops here, get a little bit better in the run game. I think they're onto something. And man, I really do. I'm a believer, and I think they're very, very close to kind of getting where they want to be on offense.
I think it's really interesting from Jake Fromm. We'll get to the later part of that comment in a moment, but I think it probably is true. With all due respect to Bobo, who I do believe is a pretty good coach, he's probably not as good an offensive coordinator as Todd Monken was and is. Monken was a gigantic success here at Georgia, but his desire was to be in the NFL, and now he's gone to the Baltimore Ravens. I would say that he's created a level of success in the playoffs for Lamar Jackson. Even though Jackson's been an MVP-level quarterback, he's never had the kind of success in the playoffs that he's having right now. I think you've got to credit Todd Monken for a lot of that. and you look at the totality of passing yards Baltimore put up this year, along with the rushing yards of both Jackson and obviously Derrick Henry, who's had a little bit of a late career rejuvenation. Once again, Todd Monken is getting a lot of credit for that, so much so that Monken seems to be perhaps on the verge of becoming an NFL head coach here right now. That's how good of a play caller he is. That, in fairness to the discussion, Mike Bobo is probably not as good an offensive coordinator as Todd Monken is, full stop, simply stated. That's just probably the case. However, the one thing I would add back to that, though, is there may be few play callers in all of football as good as Todd Monken is overall. And while Bobo may not be as good as Monken, we do see evidence in 2023 that Monken could at least, I should say that Bobo could at least perform at a similar level to what Todd Monken was putting forth. That, as I mentioned, Georgia averaged 40 points per game in 2022, but also did that last year in 2023. But the overall in-season results for Georgia in 2023 really don't look all that dissimilar to the Todd Monken era until you get to the SEC championship, where Georgia didn't score as many points as they had been scoring, ultimately lost to Alabama. But the season in total certainly speaks to an offense that functions about as well as the Todd Monken offense has been performing. And that's perhaps why someone like Jake Fromm, someone like Davin Bellamy was largely supportive of Bobo when we asked them those questions last week. Perhaps it's the evidence put forth in 2023 that would cause them to say that. Now, I know what you're going to say back to me on this. Well, yeah, but BA, 2023 is a little bit different because Georgia still had Brock Bowers, an all-time great player. And a guy like Ladd McConkey was a very good and productive receiver here at Georgia, too. That perhaps in 2023, the good offensive stats for Georgia were aided by having guys like McConkey and certainly Brock Bowers here as a part of this offense. And maybe that's true. Certainly it's easier to call plays when you've got guys like that. But I think it also kind of is an important addendum to the discussion we're having about Mike Bobo right now. In other words, you can't not give him any credit for 2023 because you had really good players, while also condemning him in 2024 when he obviously didn't have the same level of talent to work with. And that kind of goes back to something that Jake Fromm was also talking about too. You just heard him a moment ago saying, man, I thought they were close to breaking through. Seems like they could have been just a little bit better. And so the obvious natural follow-up to that is, okay, what's it going to take then? If Georgia was close to breaking through, but the stats would say they obviously didn't, how do you take that next step as an offense in 2025? What needs to be done? And that's where the conversation goes to what we were just addressing, the sort of different caliber of playmaker Georgia seemed to have in 2023 compared to what it had in 2024. Here is Jake Fromm again on that.
You got to go find a go-to guy at receiver, a guy who's going to get you out of jail. Look, it's going to be tough to find a Brock Bowers. It's going to be tough to find a Ladd McConkey. But Ladd McConkey has been – the security blanket on third down, and Brock has been that explosive guy that you could always count on. You got to find somebody like that to make your offense more explosive. And I think, too, with the offensive line, I think it kind of comes into kind of a mental state, kind of to have this tenacity and have this physicality of, hey, we are going to run the football, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. So I think that's kind of like a mental programming they have to get done in the offseason and during training camp to be able to get that done in the fall.
I mean, that's pretty pointed criticism of Jake Fromm there, of some of the players who are on the field for the Georgia offense here this year. And by the way, if you're watching in video, you'll kind of notice, and I mentioned this in some of our video a little earlier, the way we typically sort of operate the show, showing you a lot of video, we call B-roll, video clips. Some of that stuff right now, for whatever reason, we had some issues with some of our equipment here today. So the show probably looks a little bit different, probably not quite as high of production quality overall. We got some really smart folks behind the scenes working to get that fixed. Probably not for today's show, but just be aware that we are having a little bit of an issue. That's why it just kind of looks a little bit different. You're not seeing some of the same things on the screen you typically would. So just want you to be aware of that. But the point is Jake Fromm kind of says, hey, Georgia didn't really have the go-to receiver. That guy never emerged. You got to find that. Georgia's got to run the ball better than it did. And leading the way on that, you probably have to have a better performance overall from your offensive line. Once again, a pretty pointed criticism of some of the Georgia players in this offense here this year. And for what it's worth, one of Jake's former teammates also a former Georgia player, David Bellamy, when he joined us on the show last week, while also being largely complimentary of Mike Bobo, did kind of put that issue of, at times maybe, some of the Georgia players who are, for the most part, now all being paid to perform, maybe they didn't always do their job as well as they could this year. This is what David Bellamy said about that last week.
The thing that we have to put a magnifying glass on is the weapons we had. I mean, Bobo can only do so much. And me, I'm speaking from a player because the player is the one that actually plays. Well, when everything is going right and the receivers are catching the ball and our running game is going, then Bobo looks like a genius. But when you got, junior, senior wide receivers dropping 60-yard bombs, you got your left tackle getting beat, off the first move, less than 2 seconds. It's kind of tough. So, the buck is going to stop at his desk because he's the offensive coordinator. But when things are going good, things are going good. I think Georgia has to put a magnifying glass on the talent.
So once again, a very interesting statement from David Bellamy that Georgia needs to put, as he says, a magnifying glass on the talent. In other words, evaluating whether or not these players were doing the job they were supposed to do. I'll be very honest. When it comes to sort of like splitting hairs over this, what was it coaching to blame or players to blame? That's a very difficult question to answer. And, frankly, it's a little bit, I don't know. It's not very enjoyable to kind of sort of point the fingers and say, well, this guy gets that blame and this guy gets that blame. That's not a very fun conversation. I'll be, completely candid about that. But once again, when the season ends the way that it does, and when the Georgia offense plays the role that it seemed to play in that premature ending to the season, you got to have this discussion somehow, some way. So let me try to do this as a way of bridging the gap between former players like that who don't seem to want to blame Bobo very much and fans who seem to want to, at least a large pocket of fans, who seem to want to blame Bobo a lot. I think we can all agree that the Georgia offense this year wasn't what it needed to be. And if you want me to be the most candid that I possibly can, my biggest concern here is perhaps not that Georgia's got an issue that has popped up now that Mike Bobo has been hired for the 2 years that he's been in the job. I mean, the thing that I worry about sometimes is if this is a reversion back to what life for Georgia was like before Brock Bowers was here. Think about the Georgia era of Bowers, 2021, 2022, 2023. This is an all-time great Georgia player. This is a guy who legitimately may one day be remembered as the greatest tight end of all time based on his college career, based on the way that his NFL career is starting. Like, this is a guy that's probably going to be a legend at the time that his football career comes to an end. And Bowers' presence here at Georgia completely stopped a discussion that was taking place a lot before he got here, which was a Georgia program that wasn't performing as well offensively as it was defensively. If you were around then, perhaps you remember that. Think about 2020 and 2019, 2018. Some of those years in which Georgia perhaps underperformed offensively, that was a big deal for a lot of Georgia fans. Then Brock Bowers comes up. Lo and behold, Georgia starts winning national championships. Georgia starts scoring 40-plus points per game. And all the issues that seemed to exist with the Georgia offense, those issues no longer existed after that. It was just sort of over and done with. But now that Bowers is no longer here, is a lot of that stuff resurfacing again? In other words, the pressure here for me may not just be on Mike Bobo to perform better as the Georgia offensive coordinator. Some of this pressure may also be on Kirby Smart to kind of correct a narrative that prevailed around him prior to having a guy like Brock Bowers on your team, that you had some offensive issues compared to what was always sort of a stellar defense. So to sort of sum all this up and kind of make a final point on this, if you ever go to like the doctor or something like that, they ever give you like the pain scale? You know what I'm talking about? It's like a 0 through 10. And if you're a kid, it's like faces. It's like a really scrunched up face or a smiley face. It's basically like, what gradient of pain are you experiencing right now? What variation of pain are you experiencing right now? I think when it comes to disappointment about how the Georgia offense is performing, I think there's also a way to sort of answer that question too. For instance, my concern for the Georgia offense right now is not a 10. That they were good enough in 2023. They still won the SEC championship this year. They're still among the very best teams in the country. my concern for the Georgia offense overall is not at a 10. I would suggest if yours is, you should, seek help for that. I mean, I think that's too much of an overreaction to what is legitimate concern. But because it is a legitimate concern, it's also not a 0 for me either, that it's probably somewhere in the middle of all of that where I do believe that there is, I think, real intrigue about, can Georgia be better in 2025? Can they show the needed improvement? It's not obvious to me that they will, but I do believe Kirby Smart has earned the benefit of the doubt to be able to prove it one way or another, that we are only 2 seasons removed from 2 straight national championships for Georgia. And to think that Kirby Smart, just 24 months after doing what is essentially an unprecedented feat for UGA and almost any other program in college football, would now have to fire an offensive coordinator in disgrace, I would say if that's all you get for winning, to be right back in the pressure cooker less than 2 years later, then what's the point of winning? That surely the success that Georgia has had ought to buy you some grace somewhere to sort of figure some of this kind of stuff out. And if Mike Bobo is the handpicked selection for Kirby Smart to do that, the track record of success for Kirby ought to provide some space for that to happen. And I don't know for sure it's going to work out the way we all want to. It may not. But I do believe that Kirby Smart has earned the track record to sort of figure this out in his own way. So to sort of sum all this up and put a bow on it, those of you who see some issues with the Georgia offense, I think, are pointing out some factual truths. This group this year, this side of the ball this year for Georgia was not as good as it once was. But this was still an SEC championship season. We are still just 2 years removed from back-to-back national championships. And Georgia, over the course of like the last half decade, has only lost a small handful of games. That while we may be concerned about the Georgia offense, I don't think there's room for panic. And I think the proper response is maybe even a little bit of optimism. That a program that seems to figure out things over and over and over again, that quite possibly they might figure this out too. They certainly need to, but given what Georgia's in the past, who among us can say they won't be better next season, because showing improvement when it really needs to happen is something that Georgia's been pretty good at. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We are glad you were with us today. Really appreciate you being a part of the program. And we want to thank our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia, make it all possible, too. We just came across a pretty cold weekend, right, where it's like temperatures, it's cold for me usually means 40, but these were some of these nighttime temperatures where it's getting down to like 20 degrees, and maybe in some cases where you were even colder than that. And it's a totally different experience when the temperature is that cold and stays that way for a long time, especially if you have improperly sealed windows or just sort of old and kind of past their shelf life type windows in your home. Our friends at Pella Window and Door will tell us that when it comes to the energy inside your home, about 30% of the energy that you have in your house, think about your heating bill here for a moment, the heat that's kind of coming from your furnace, about 30% of that can be like wasted if you don't have the right kind of windows. That's why as we think about 2025 here, perhaps it's time for you to talk about the upgrade for the windows there in your home. To make your home look better on the outside, that's a nice thing to do. It's always great to take good care of your home, but to also feel better on the inside. And you'll certainly feel better when that heating bill comes to you and all of a sudden you see, hey, this is less than it used to be. I'm getting a more comfortable home experience for similar dollars before, because all of a sudden now the energy in my home is sort of staying right where it's supposed to be. That's what Pella Window and Door of Georgia is all about. So if you're a homeowner that wants to take the best possible care of your home, our friends at Pella are going to give you a chance to do that. Why don't you reach out to them today? Online, it's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. You can also give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is always going beyond. And if you want to go beyond just sort of the basic, kind of run-of-the-mill thing for your home, take the best possible care you can of that property, obviously great upgraded windows from Pella or an upgraded entry door, because so much of the kind of home insulation kind of comes from that entry door too. Plus, there's nothing that kind of benefits your curb appeal and therefore your resale value like a gorgeous entry door might, the likes of which you're going to get from our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. All of that available for you too. Plus, there's great savings right now. Between now and January 30th, you can get $500 off Pella projects and 0% APR for 24 months. So big savings right now. Make sure you check them out today. One more time, it's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. That's PellaGA.com/DawgNation. You can also give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is going beyond. All right, so we got Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in a moment. Fun conversation coming up with him. We'll kind of address a lot of the issues that are going on here right now. Prior to that, though, I do want to go around the doghouse, presented today by Dr. Pepper, and we have new details about which we spent a whole bunch of time talking about on Friday, the decision of Carson Beck transfer to Miami. We now know some of the, I guess, at least reported anyway, financial ramifications and all this. Now, some of the major outlets have a little bit of a dispute, at least about some of these numbers. I'm going to give you this, though, from 24/7 Sports. The Athletic has said the actual number may be closer to $3 million, but 24/7 Sports, John Talty, the writer here, is reporting that Georgia transfer quarterback Carson Beck is expected to receive an NIL package that pays him $4 million in 2025, sources told CBS Sports. It's a massive sum, and I get this now. It's still less than his initial asking price. I always love these industry sources. Industry sources believe that if Beck had gotten what he wanted, it would have shattered the highest paid NIL deal in college football history. So Beck was asking for more money than anybody's ever gotten. The only school that seemed to be even involved in this negotiation really at all, the best we can tell, was Miami. They didn't give him what he wanted, but apparently, according to John Talty, CBS Sports, and 24/7 Sports, they gave him $4 million. The Athletic says it may be closer to $3 million, but whatever. Beck got a ton of money. Now, let me tell you why this is interesting, or at least it should be, I think, interesting to you, is that when it comes to the evaluation of Carson Beck no longer being here, I really don't think any of this comes down to, well, is Beck a good player or not? Beck is at least a good player. Now, is he a great player based on the way that he played this season? I think a lot of us would say no, probably not. But is he a good player based on some of those same moments? I think we would probably say that he is. So this is not an issue of is Beck good or not, and was it good to have him here at Georgia? For the most part, I think it was good to have Carson Beck here at Georgia. All of this comes down to, is he good at the price you would have to pay? And I don't think there's any surprise, nor should it be shocking to any of you, that given a price tag similar to that, Georgia had no interest in being in the Carson Beck business anymore. That's why you're going to hear Georgia's perhaps ready to move on and Beck is perhaps ready to move on, because Georgia's went there, sort of been there, done that when it comes to Beck, as the architect of this offense, or the sort of main, engineer of this offense, if you want to say it that way. And the sort of hope that, Beck could be the sort of focal point, the way that a Brock Bowers would have been before, maybe cultivate some playmakers, because he was, after all, supposed to be the first-round quarterback. That didn't happen. And the money that Georgia invested in him in the hopes that would happen perhaps was not money well spent. So some of Beck moving on is not Georgia condemning him as not a good player. It's just simply a business decision of, well, if this is what Miami is willing to pay you, we have no interest in paying that same level of money to you, especially when we saw 6 quarters in postseason of Gunnar Stockton and actually kind of liked what Gunnar Stockton brought to the table. So a lot of that then kind of goes to, well, how then should Beck be remembered at Georgia? What's the feeling about, what Beck is and how should he be remembered? And the line comes up about, well, is Beck a DGD? Is he, as I said, is he a damn good dog? The way in which a lot of former players sometimes sort of, get that love and get that label attached to them. And it's kind of interesting to watch this debate unfold. Our buddy Matt Stinchcomb, and I think our guys found this. Our buddy Matt Stinchcomb, John's brother, and John, of course, join us in a minute, wrote about this on the X platform this week. He says, if you're a Georgia football fan, what even constitutes being a DGD? Now, it's not obvious that Matt was referencing Carson Beck with this question, but it certainly comes in context of that discussion being ongoing about Carson Beck. And so Here's what I'll say about this right now, and then in a minute we'll ask Jon Stinchcomb to kind of weigh in with his own thoughts here for a moment. As far as whether, like, Beck is a DGD for Georgia or not, would it be fair to reserve judgment on that for a little while? Would it be fair to sort of postpone that analysis for a little while? Because on the one hand, I am thankful that Georgia had Carson Beck in the 8 overtime win against Georgia Tech. I thought it was really cool the way that Beck sort of valiantly came back on the field for the final play in the SEC championship. There were some times at Georgia where, hey, I really enjoyed Carson Beck. I was really glad that he was here. Thankful for the contribution that he made to UGA. But then when you see him like on, is it TikTok or whatever, dancing with his girlfriend, whatever her name is, and, doing like the you thing, it's like honestly, like, I get secondhand embarrassment from that. I would hope that Beck himself would be embarrassed to be a part of that kind of thing. Perhaps he's not. It seems like he isn't. But, depending on how this transition from Georgia to Miami goes and how many more of these like TikTok-style videos we have to endure, that I think would also sort of factor into, well, did he leave Georgia better than he found it? That's something we've talked about before. Is this a guy where like the good moments outweigh whatever issues you perhaps had? Or is it going to be one of those things where it just becomes this sort of ever-present factor in these sort of social media, viral video type things, and all of a sudden that's kind of the only thing that Georgia fans can remember about him? I think it's a relatively complicated topic in the person of Beck, and especially given the fanfare that his transfer is going to kind of come with. Whereas when guys like Jacob Eason or JT Daniels left, you didn't hear very much from them at all. They didn't cultivate a whole lot of drama. It'll be interesting to see, given Beck's ever-present status on these videos with what's-her-face, whether or not he can avoid the same level of drama those guys have in the past. So when it comes to the overall sort of DGD status of Carson Beck, whether he has it or not, would it be okay to withhold judgment on that for a moment? Some of the good times for him at UGA would suggest that he might be. Some of the, stuff related to this transition suggests that some Georgia fans may never want to give him credit for that. We'll make that Around the Doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And, of course, you're getting ready for the national championship, at least I think many of us are, watching a lot of football. The great taste of Dr. Pepper goes great with that, whether Georgia's playing the game or not. I believe our friends at Dr. Pepper also have a really fun announcement coming up really soon. You're going to want to stay close to all the national championship coverage for a lot more on that. And, of course, we go through 2025 here. The great taste of Dr. Pepper is a great thing to have with you no matter what you're doing. So as you're shopping at your local Kroger, wherever you're going for your groceries, pick up some delicious, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper. College football, Dr. Pepper, it's a pepper thing. We love our friends at Dr. Pepper. We're proud to have them here as a part of DawgNation Daily. We hope you'll enjoy some as you're doing some grocery shopping here right now. As I was locked into my house this weekend, we certainly enjoyed plenty of Dr. Pepper. It was a really fun thing. And so I hope you'll check all of that out here today. So there is a lot going on around Georgia. The Beck departure, the Bobo criticism, and everything else in between. And so without further ado, let's keep that conversation going as we welcome in Jon Stinchcomb here today, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insight.
Let me bring in Jon Stinchcomb here, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. John, always appreciate your time. I guess let me start with sort of the news. We'll get to some of the opinion part of it. What did you make when you first heard that Carson Beck was not going to the NFL draft, was going to Miami? We now know, as we would have expected anyway, exorbitant NIL fee to kind of, I guess, motivate this transfer here. What do you make about Beck not going to the NFL as we initially thought and now going to play in college football somewhere else? We know this now to be Miami.
I continue to marvel at the direction that college football has taken. Obviously, it stings anytime Georgia players opt to go elsewhere at the collegiate level, especially those that are productive. But I think it speaks to a bigger issue that college football has. And it's sad to me to see guys make choices. Now, I don't fault Carson Beck. I understand what's available to him and the options that were on the table, and he's coming off an injury, and he has an opportunity to improve his draft status like he did this past year and get compensated handsomely in the process. So for him, it's a business decision. I think we've seen that and heard that term elsewhere, including guys during signing day that were potential Georgia players that have, quote unquote, made business decisions. And that's the way that college football is headed, is financially and monetarily driven. Obviously, it's been impacted by money a long time, but to see that at individual player level, I think it's kind of a sour note as a fan that you watch and you go, what used to be is gone. And we live in a new world where, each year you're trying to recruit your own players to stay and cherry pick from other programs and understand that some guys are going to head for, quote unquote, greener pastures at other places.
So my evaluation on this is I think that Georgia thinks that Carson Beck is a good player. There's certainly enough evidence to suggest that he is. I also get the sense, though, at sort of a 7-figure price tag, Georgia had no interest in kind of going back down that road again, because I think investing at least a similar sum of money this past year, that wasn't always money well spent. That while Beck was good, I don't know how much he elevated the players around him. And frankly, I don't know how great the team chemistry was for Georgia on that side of the ball. That Beck's a good player, but everything now is sort of good at what price? And at the sort of price we're hearing thrown around here, that just does not seem like a very wise of investment. And as cold and calculated as that evaluation seems to be, that's what the sport sort of is now, isn't it? I mean, do you agree with me on that this is not about the quality of Beck as a player? It's about the value based on the price. And I think in the eyes of those of us who watched the Georgia offense in 2024, that Beck left a lot to be desired?
Yeah, BA, you look at how they spread the assets this time around, and you're going, where could we have improved? We could have improved in the wide receiver room. We've brought in a lot of guys, both from the high school ranks and from other programs in a short period of time. And let's be honest, it's going to cost money to bring those guys in. And there's only so many assets that you have to disperse across the team. And I think Georgia probably had to take a step back and look at the investment they had in Carson and where they had to shave a little, and decided that that's not the ratio of disbursement of assets that they want to make. And isn't it sad? It sounds like we're talking about NFL salary caps, and it is very similar to that model, to what the collectives are having to do and what coaches are doing with the collectives, and trying to figure out what's the best recipe for success. And putting all their eggs, if you will, in one basket is not the direction they wanted to go. And, that 3 to 4 million mark is, I don't think, a far departure from what he received at Georgia this past year. So if anything, it was looking at it, what's best for all parties moving forward. And, obviously Georgia has made an emphasis of bringing in some talent in other positions.
So I want to ask you more about Beck in a moment. Let me ask you a question about Miami here for a second. And I think you and I both live probably fairly modest lifestyles, but have you ever been to a restaurant where they have sometimes it's like gold flakes on the martini, or something just to make it really expensive, and people seem to want to order it because it's expensive. They kind of like the idea of spending a lot of money. I sort of get the impression that Miami's NIL sort of functions that way. And I'm not trying to be a hater here. I'm just trying to point out that I don't quite know who Miami was negotiating with when it comes to Beck. And that's pretty similar to a year ago when it came to Cam Ward. Now, Ward obviously had a great year for Miami. Nobody disputes that. But a year ago, it was sort of Miami or nothing for Ward. I get the impression it was sort of Miami or nothing for Beck, where they're essentially negotiating with themselves of, paying this huge fee for a quarterback when Texas Tech said they weren't involved in this. Ohio State's trying to win a national championship. You got to imagine they're not super involved in this right now either. The Alabama rumors seem to be sort of made up from whole cloth from Facebook. It was sort of Miami or nothing once again, and yet they're still out there just throwing millions on top of millions when it comes to stuff like this. I think they must just like spending money.
Well, I think they're competing with the Giants and the Browns and every other NFL team where Carson's marketing agent is going, there's opportunity for this guy to go make millions come April. So for him to come back it's got to be a pretty sweet incentive. Now, obviously, it's beneficial for Carson. He's got another bite at the apple. He can heal. He can be that number one rated quarterback that he thought he was going to be and others thought he potentially could be heading into the 24 season. So obviously it makes sense for him if the money's right. And for Miami, they're doing that same calculation of, not only are they competing with other college teams, and maybe those were some smoke and mirrors by the marketing team around Carson, but they're also competing against the NFL. And I think that is one of the biggest threats around football. You look at the Diego situation in Vanderbilt, and guys are wanting to stick around. They're begging for an extra year, and some of the restrictions that used to limit the length that a player could play in collegiate football, those are being lifted. The availability to transfer into greener pastures and get paid more has been lifted. There's opportunities for guys to stay and get paid, and they want to do that for longer. As a matter of fact, some of these guys, and we could probably name a few that have left Georgia, have taken pay cuts to go play in the NFL. So it's one of the models, and like it or not, all the fans out there are going, I hate this model. Well, I'm right there with you, but they didn't ask our opinion, and it is what it is. So I'm not mad at Carson. I'm mad at the system, because the system has devalued so much of what has been foundational to what has built college football to where it is.
I want to talk about how Beck's going to be remembered for a moment, because your brother kind of started this thing on social media, and not referencing Beck, but a lot of people sort of tied it into Carson Beck about like what a DGD is supposed to be, the idea of sort of a damn good dog. And, my feelings on this are complicated, John, when it comes to the Beck part of this, because on the one hand, I could talk for half an hour about stuff I don't like about Beck without repeating myself, just being completely honest with you. I just he is definitely wired differently than I am, and that's certainly his prerogative to be so, but it's also my prerogative to have preferences, and I would say that my preferences are a little bit different than some of Beck. It certainly seems anyway. But that said, I am still open to the idea that Beck is, air quotes here, DGD, because honestly, there were a lot of times over the last couple of years in which I was kind of happy to have him. And the fact that he did patiently wait at Georgia from 2020 until 2023, kind of for his turn, and seemed to be willing to mature over the course of that time, there was a certain appreciation I sort of have for that. What I told our audience a moment ago was, in terms of the overall sort of DGD status of Carson Beck, which if you're not a Georgia fan, that kind of thing doesn't matter to you, but I can promise you to Georgia fans, at least to a lot of them, it certainly does matter. Like, my specific opinion right now is I want to withhold judgment, because, I do think when you look at, coming into the SEC championship in the final play, for instance, that's an example of a memory that could stand the test of time at Georgia. But if it's too many more of these TikTok videos where he's, dancing around and, making the U symbol with what's-her-face, well, at that point in time, then some of the good times at Georgia become a little bit more difficult to remember. And once again, I'm just being as honest as I can possibly be. So there's plenty about Beck that's not my cup of tea necessarily. Even when he was doing well at Georgia, some of the stuff that he did, I didn't always love. But still, there is a sense of appreciation for me where, hey, maybe he did leave Georgia better than he found it. Maybe he did make a contribution here that's worthy of being commended. What are you going to come down on the notion that Beck either is or isn't, as Georgia fans like to say, a DGD?
Well, let's start with the term DGD. For me, the standard is a little bit higher than I was kind of happy to have him, which is, I'm just quoting you, PA.
Sure.
That's what you just referred to him. There are so many players that fall under that category. Man, I was happy to have them. I'm glad they were a part of our team. But I hold DGD at a higher standard. I think you talk about terms that get kind of floated out there and abused at times. It's elite, and he's the GOAT. And you're like, well, you just said that about 3 players on one team in 1 year. It's hard to be the GOAT, the greatest ever of all time, if you have 3 on the same team at the same time. So it's terms like that. It's like the Mount Rushmore. I think there's a standard that is a little bit higher. It's elevated. So when I talk about DGDs, I think of like Nick Chubb and Champ Bailey and DJ Shockley, guys that have represented Georgia exceptionally well on the field and off the field, and are lifelong dogs that every time you hear that name, it puts a smile on your face to be associated with the program, to be associated with Georgia football. And they're the best ambassadors. Stetson Bennett, a guy who wins 2 national championships, probably falls under that category, right? I think there's some guys where you're just going, it makes too much sense. They elevated the program. They've always been great ambassadors and representatives of the brand. And that is in a very exclusive title that very few can attain, and I think we all should aspire to. But if you're also giving hand signals for other teams shortly thereafter and other programs, it's probably not the bar or the standard at which I would hold a player to kind of receive that moniker of being a DGD.
Okay, so I'm really glad you're saying what you're saying, because I think a lot of people agree with what you're saying. And what I'm about to say, and once again, if you're not a Georgia fan, all this seems really silly, but to a lot of Georgia fans, this kind of thing really matters, so that this is who we're talking to right now. What I'm about to say is going to be incredibly controversial, but I do really believe this. I don't think the idea of a DGD should be an exclusive club. In other words, like Nick Chubb and guys like that, whatever they are is more than a DGD, like Ring of Honor or retired jersey or whatever else. But we can make a list of like, and I would say you and your brother in that category, but like, people that made a contribution to Georgia that's more than DGD. This is like, and maybe we need a name for it, but there are like all-time greats, but I don't think you have to be an all-time great to be a DGD. In fact, I know a lot of Georgia fans. They're not active on social media. They're not major NIL donors, but they go to every game. They support this team. They've been loyal through decades. I sort of think of them as DGDs. And so therefore, the sort of quiet Georgia fan who just sort of silently supports and stays dedicated over the course of years, if that guy's a DGD, and I believe many of them are, then I think there's room for sort of a lot of players to be DGDs. In fact, we would all say, well, Nick Chubb, he's definitely a DGD. Roquan Smith, definitely a DGD. You know what? I think Tate Crowder's a DGD. He scooped up a squib kick in the 2017 Rose Bowl right at the half and preserved a field goal right there that narrowed the gap, that gave Georgia a chance to win. That's a great moment. It's sort of a small biography that would make him a DGD, but in my mind, that is an indelible image that sort of, I would say, sort of stands the test of time. So I think this conversation is an interesting one, because I think a lot of people sort of feel the way that you do of, well, gosh, if you call so-and-so a DGD, then that's disrespect to true DGDs like Sony Michel or Jordan Davis or players of that caliber. And I would say that we don't need to be gatekeepers and make the sort of DGD status an exclusive club, because I think there are a lot of ways to perhaps leave Georgia better than you found it.
I look forward to you coming up with the next term for what's the step up, the funnel that, if DGD is a wider gate, what is it? A D double G?
Yeah.
I don't know what that would even be, but I get it. Our definitions might be a little different. And you just listed a number of players that kind of fall in that category. I think one of the bars for me, one of the standards that or boxes that needs to be checked when we're talking about a DGD, whether it doesn't just have to be football players. I think there's great ambassadors for the University of Georgia, and specifically sports, the athletic department, is that you put Georgia first. And I think when we see other players that, if you're to transfer to another place, I understand it. It's part of a business decision that you make. But, that's one of the boxes for me that, Jordan Davis, you mentioned, he is always a Georgia first guy. After all the games, you watch social media, and half of Philadelphia's team is taking pictures with the 2 or 3 other players from other NFL teams that they all played at Georgia one time or another. And they're always representing Georgia well. And I think when players choose to go to other universities, that's one of the boxes that I think, you take that check away and you're no longer representative of our university. And I can understand that. And I appreciate the commitments and the contributions that you've made to the program. For me and my standard, if you will, for what it takes to be a DGD, I think it's being able to represent the university at all times and hold it dear. And so, I think that's one of the boxes that has to be checked for my definition of what a DGD is.
I think it's really interesting. And from there, we'll kind of leave the controversial definition of what a DGD is and move to something that's a lot less controversial, like the performance of Mike Bobo this year as offensive coordinator. I promised our audience I give you a chance to weigh on this. Many of our former players that join us each week have. The numbers speak to offensive regression. But, John, I don't pretend to be smart enough to necessarily know how much of that Mike Bobo is supposed to own. So let me ask you, what blame do you put on Mike Bobo for the fact the Georgia offense this year was not really a nationally elite unit?
Yeah, I'm not a Bobo basher, nor am I a Bobo defender. I look back at games and you see plays that were designed that gets guys wide open. You see plays that, just weren't executed well. And you're going, are we going to look at those and scrutinize those on the same level as the plays where you're going, this doesn't make sense. We're running the ball into a box or into a front where we're not going to be able to have success, or, the protections aren't holding up because they're not designed well, or the route combinations we're not giving guys opportunities to get open. So I've tried to be as unbiased as possible, and I think I'm in a pretty decent position to do that.
Mm-hmm.
In that, I have an appreciation for the job that a coordinator has of trying to put your team in the best position to be successful. And if I'm going to be fair, I think our run game was not good enough. It caused problems across the entire team, and part of it's execution, but part of it to me was design. And when I look at it, there were plays that were designed in the pass game where guys were open, we just missed it, whether drop pass or missed ball. So is there room for improvement? Yes. Do I think Mike Bobo should be replaced? Absolutely not. I am not at the point now where I've seen such an egregious coordination of plays that what we called when we called it against the teams that we played, that you're going, we've got to do better. As a matter of fact, I think if anything, there is equal burden, and I think there's earned opportunity. I think Coach Bobo's earned the right to say, I wasn't out there dropping passes. I wasn't out there missing blocks. I wasn't out there missing throws. I tried to put them in positions, and at times, I think we all could point to specific plays. You're going, man, that was beautifully designed. And if you can't, I'd be happy to point some out and show you, because I think at times there are fans that come into these games just waiting for that opportunity to say, see, Bobo stinks. And I don't think that's fair either.
We'll finish with this. How optimistic are you that they'll be better in 2025? Like how certain do you feel like you are that the needed improvement this unit needs will actually take place?
I'm not certain. I think there's potential for some regression in places. And it just means that players are going to have to get better. And that's why Georgia recruits at such a high level, is they look at their roster and say, we're going to lose talent. We need guys to be a part of this program. I look at the offensive line. First off, I don't think we have 4 NFL players on that offensive line from this past season, despite the fact that 4 are heading to the NFL, or at least heading to the hopes of playing in the NFL. So, you can judge those decisions as you will. But to replace 4 guys, we've seen both tackles potentially that are at least penciled into those positions, and Monroe Freeling and Ernest Green, both guys that they have to get better, right? We can all agree with that. On the interior, Micah Morris, we've seen. Drew Bobo, we've seen. And, there are still a number of guys that are in-house that have been a part of this program for a number of years where you're going, you've got to step up. I start with the offensive line because that's what I know, and 4 of the 5 are going to need to be replaced. You look at the talent in other positions, outside linebacker is an area of concern, really linebackers in general now. outside edge rushers with not only guys heading into the transfer portal, but graduations and the loss of some really talented players. There's some areas of concern. Now, when is that not the case? I think it's usually for most programs, you understand that you're going to lose top level players. When we won our first national championship, you look at the number of guys that left for the NFL and you're going, man, that's a lot of talent that Georgia's going to need to replace. And they were able to do that. So I think Georgia they have a challenge in front of them. They're going to have to replace talent and get guys better, improve where they were, guys that are coming back and say, we've got to play better and have some unknown names or unknown to the fact that they haven't played a lot and contributed with a G on the side of their helmet. They're going to have to step up. Now, that's what this entire offseason's for. That's what training camp is for, is to get guys up to speed and ready. It's the same thing with Gunnar Stockton, right? So great example of somebody that we didn't get to see a lot of, but yet when given the opportunity, I think performed as if he was ready for that opportunity. And so that's the expectation. That's the standard that Kirby Smart has led all of DawgNation to, of saying we are competing for championships on an annual basis, no matter who we lose. So that's the expectation heading into 25.
Well, John, whatever a DGD is, we certainly believe that you are one. We appreciate all your insight into what's going on with UGA and the obvious challenge awaiting the Dogs. They try to get kind of back into that national championship picture for next year. Thanks for your time. Appreciate your thoughts. We will look forward to a chance to talk to you soon.
Always enjoy it, BA. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So let me try to quickly address this for a moment. Georgia Jaguar, among others, in the YouTube comment section say, man, you got Beck on video making the Miami throwing up the U sign. You can't be a DGD if you're doing stuff like that. Just keep this in mind, though. Like, Mark Richt once did the same thing. Now, surely whatever anyone's definition of DGD is would include Mark Richt. But when Richt got fired by Georgia, Richt's down there in South Florida doing the U, holding it up, and taking the Miami coaching job. But what we found out is after a couple of years, his time in Coral Gables after leaving Georgia ended up being just a footnote of his career, and moved back to Athens and, kind of became as much of a sort of a Georgia figure emeritus as there could be. All I would say about the Carson Beck stuff is let's give this some space and just sort of see where it goes. Sometimes you're a transfer like Jermaine Burton, who ends up kind of rubbing on people the wrong way. But sometimes you're a transfer like A.D. Mitchell, who left Georgia after game-winning touchdown catch against Ohio State, go-ahead touchdown of the Alabama 2021 national championship game. Like, that's a guy who, even though he transferred, went elsewhere, certainly left Georgia better than he found it because of the big plays that he made in big moments. And so, I think Mitchell, despite the fact that he played at Texas, is still sort of thought by many to be a Georgia guy, rightly so. Someone like Jermaine Burton probably isn't, even though Burton had a couple of nice moments in a Georgia uniform too. And in the situation with Beck here, this could go on to be something sort of controversial and sort of overly dramatic, or it could be a little bit like a JT Daniels or a Jacob Eason, that once they transferred, they never said spoke ill about Georgia. And frankly, whatever they did after leaving Georgia, frankly, became pretty unimportant in the grand scheme of things. So I think you've got some things that Beck did well while he was here. I think you've got some, real sources of irritation for a lot of Georgia fans. Let's just sort of give this some time. Let's revisit this a little bit from now and sort of see, how exactly do we feel about Beck, a year from now, 2 years from now. But just the simple idea of throwing up the U, if Beck is disqualified for that, then Mark Richt would be as well. And Mark Richt, no matter what your definition of DGD is, Mark Richt should be, I say, in that category for all of what he brought to Georgia while he was here, including a bunch of players who were obviously, in anybody's book, DGD. So a fun topic, albeit a little bit complicated maybe too. Let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean here right now, getting ready for a great DawgNation cruise coming up in April. Now that we're in 2025, of course, that will be here before you know it. Utopia of the Seas is going to be amazing, and I can't wait to celebrate with all of you on board there. An SEC championship, a lot of the fun things that Georgia's been able to do this season. We'll tell good stories. We'll have a good time, specially themed Dawg Nation events. We think a Royal Caribbean Cruise vacation is always great, but the specially themed Dawg Nation events just for the Georgia fans on board, and frankly, I think y'all are DGDs too, those of you who come on the cruise with us. But we'll have a great time. We can't wait to see you for it. Give Jessica Slater a call. Wonderful travel agent, specially selected for us by Royal Caribbean. You can give her a call 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email Jessica, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll get you booked up on a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation here for 2025. All right, let's do a couple of things here just for a moment. Let me start with this. So Ohio State beats Texas, advances to the national championship game. We talked about Notre Dame winning on Friday's show, so let's do a little bit of the Ohio State part of this here right now. There is one thing that I'm always pretty impressed with by Ohio State. I don't take great pride in admitting this, but this has been true for me now for a number of years. That Ohio State, at its best teams, are typically pretty dynamic. What I mean by that is when you think about a really good Ohio State offense, you think about the sort of 1,000-yard style receivers who are a lot of explosive catches. You know, Ohio State's actually not as explosive offensive as they used to be, but they still sort of have the sort of star player offensively. Think Jeremiah Smith, kind of racking up the big stats. That's just something they've done. Defensively, the same way. Now, they went through a period of time for a few years where they actually weren't very good defensively. They are much better now. But the best Ohio State defenses, whether it be back in the Chase Young era or like with Jack Sawyer right now, they sack quarterbacks. They sacked Texas 6 times in the Cotton Bowl the other night. That the best versions of Ohio State, pretty dynamic on both offense and defense. You know, that is certainly something that I, find to be pretty impressive about them. And, we said going into the game that we thought that while they would win game, we thought had a really good chance of being closer than the experts thought, simply because it's hard to replicate the kind of success they had been having for a third consecutive game. When you go to that kind of final sequence and the play calling that's going to be criticized from Sark and some of that, once again, Quinn Ewers just sort of holding on to the ball forever. When you see that play out, Texas has its chance there to narrow that gap and get inside the point spread. They're obviously not able to do it. But when you look at what Texas has now done in 3 consecutive games, beating the Longhorns, I should say Ohio State has done in 3 consecutive games, beating Texas by a couple of touchdowns, blowing out Oregon, blowing out Tennessee, this has been quite an impressive postseason performance. And they'll face a Notre Dame defense next Monday in Atlanta that's certainly good enough to make it hard for Ohio State. But a lot of this game will be a referendum on the Buckeyes of, hey, are they going to now coast to a national championship and completely erase the frustration that existed for a lot of their fans after losing to Michigan? Pretty fascinating story here. Ohio State's obviously getting hot at the exact right time. Now, let me say kind of one more thing about this just for a moment. Have you seen a lot of whether it's social media posts or, topics on podcasts and TV shows and things like that of the SEC is left out of the national championship for a second consecutive year? Have you seen that talking point that's out there? Perhaps you have. And here's what my response would be to that as someone who kind of lives down here in the SEC and the team that we enjoy covering and watching, and a big part of our lives is, of course, in the SEC. I feel like these sort of non-SEC types can't have it both ways. You can't be parading around over the course of the last few weeks and say, well, now the SEC is a conference just like any other, that all the conferences are the same, and the SEC is a conference just like anybody else, while also making such a big deal of the fact that the SEC for a second consecutive year is not playing for the national championship. You can't have it both ways. It's not remarkable that the SEC isn't playing for the national championship while simultaneously being true that the SEC is a league just like any other. That is a obvious logical fallacy that, seems easily recognizable for many of us, but perhaps not so much for others. That it's just bizarre how hard some folks are trying to work to really accentuate what they believe is the end of the SEC's era of dominance. And to be frank, for a lot of us, this comes across as something other than emotionless neutrality, if you get my point, that some of the hard work being done by, loud voices on social media, talking heads on TV, people with sort of official capacities in some form or fashion, that the work that they're doing and kind of throwing dirt on the SEC right now, Georgia included, by the way, doesn't seem to be coming from the most objective place that we, I think, need to make some room for. If someone like me, and I say this all the time, I'm a little bit of an SEC homer. Not only is Georgia my favorite team, but watching the other SEC teams play against each other is probably the only sports thing that I still like as much as I always have. You know, as you get a little older, I don't watch the NBA at all anymore. Couldn't tell you one storyline from that league. You know, I kind of watch the NFL more towards the late stage of the season when you get to the playoffs than during the regular season. Just almost anything from a sporting standpoint, I do less than I used to. I still love SEC football as much as I ever did. So you can say that I'm an SEC homer. I think we also need to sort of make a category in our mind of the kind of the SEC hater. And some of these guys that do this, and they're not all guys, but some of these guys that do this are sort of self-professed. Like Danny Cannell, for instance, sort of made that part of his shtick. There are other people operating on the guise of sort of objective journalists that we see sort of a continual pattern that would seem to suggest that total objectivity not quite being achieved. I don't know. I guess do with that what you will. Related to that, and I'll show you this on the screen, there was an incredible photo last night. I think we have this. Incredible photo last night of Georgia players for both the Green Bay Packers and the Philadelphia Eagles gathered together post-game. Jason Dumas has this. And if you go check out his X account, it's J. Dumas Reports, in addition to the photo you see here, he's also got a video of all this. And at one point in time, they're also trying to get Eddie Gordon, who is an offensive line assistant for the Green Bay Packers, to be part of that photo. Gordon obviously once worked at Georgia, and so they wanted to make him know they thought he deserved to be in this picture too, which is perhaps a very interesting thing to consider for future conversations about the Georgia offensive line. Eddie Gordon getting a lot of love from the likes of Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis and Nakobe Dean and Nolan Smith and all these guys. But when you see this level of the point of all this is, Jason Dumas' photo here, when you see this level of talent in one place at one time and you realize that of the 2021 Georgia football team that won the national championship, essentially every starter is going to get drafted, and the defense is going to have, I don't know, how many total first-round picks when it's all said and done. Like when you look at that level of success, talent acquisition-wise, that Georgia had in both 2021 and 2022. And you see a lot of this on the same field with Green Bay and Philadelphia, but you could have also seen some of that with Pittsburgh too, for instance, playing in a completely different playoff game. That the college football world doesn't view this photo as an accomplishment to be celebrated. They view this as a problem to be solved. That there are a lot of people, whether it be in the media apparatus or the sort of bureaucratic rule-making part of the sport, whatever else, there are a lot of people who view this photo of Javon Bullard and Nolan Smith and Nakobe Dean and Lewis Seen. They view this as not a, hey, man, it's great that one team can get this much talent. They view this as, we need to make sure this never happens again. And everything that's going on in the sport right now would seem to be structured in such a way that teams like Georgia don't hoard this much of their unfair share of that kind of talent. And you see them spiking the football left and right of how much their plan, and I do believe it was a plan, how much of their plan has worked. Because all of a sudden, not only do teams like Georgia not have this quite the same level of talent anymore, all of a sudden now the SEC is nowhere to be found. So do with that what you will. Our sort of secret suspicion the entire time is that all of this chaos that exists around college football has been self-imposed, imposed for a purpose. The purpose of any system is the outcome it produces. And the outcome it has produced a little bit more balance in the overall playing field of college football, because the sort of photos like this of all these players that went to the same school, nobody around college football wants to see that same imbalance in the future. And seemingly they are working very, very hard to make sure that never occurs. One more quick point here just for a moment. Speaking of talent acquisition, Georgia apparently going to miss out on Maquise Grace. Do you know who this is? We talked about him before. The edge rusher from South Dakota, big year, had like 18 and a half tackles for loss, had taken a visit, I think, to Georgia. But ultimately, Grace, though, not going to land, it appears, at UGA. Reports are that he is on his way to Kentucky. Kentucky had been, I think, viewed to be the leader before Georgia got involved It seems like Georgia tried to make something happen here late, but perhaps kind of always destined to go the way of Kentucky. Kentucky gets a win for Grace, and just given the success that he'd had at South Dakota, pretty good FCS level program, perhaps a guy that can do some nice things in the SEC, but not, though, at Georgia. Appears that's going to be at Kentucky, and will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, as we transition away from that, let me remind you of something else here just for a moment, that if you want to get the best of Dawg Nation delivered right to your inbox every day, covering all the things going on with UGA football, but now not just Georgia football. How about the great success of the Georgia basketball team, too? All the fun things happening with the Georgia Bulldogs. We call it our Hunker Download. It's our brand new and upgraded newsletter from DawgNation. If you go to DawgNation.com/newsletter, you can sign up, have this delivered right to your inbox. I think you're going to love it. It's DawgNation.com/newsletter. You can sign up for that today. Now, speaking of the Georgia basketball team, they get another huge ranked win on Saturday against Oklahoma, and another kind of by double-digit points here. This is a Georgia team that's, I think, poised to enter the top 25 here today, fresh off consecutive wins against ranked opponents. And Stegman Coliseum was rocking this week, last week for the win against Kentucky, rocking on Saturday, despite the bad weather and the tough travels that many folks had to getting there. Georgia students were amazing once again. And another kind of statement win for Mike White's Georgia basketball team, really sort of arriving here on the national scene. This is what White said about that win on Saturday.
Got really loud in there. It was fun. Got enough stops down the stretch against one of the best offenses in the country to pull away. You know, Oklahoma's really good, so we're very fortunate, and it's a very good win for us.
So a very good win indeed, and an interesting response to kind of handling success against Kentucky and then kind of replicating that against Oklahoma. Obviously, this matters because the grind gets even tougher for Georgia this week at Tennessee on Wednesday, hosting what may be the number one team in the country, Auburn, on Saturday. This past week, Tennessee was number one, Auburn was number two. So you got these, highly ranked teams you're going to play here this week, and Georgia kind of taking these opponents on fresh off back-to-back wins against both Kentucky and Oklahoma. How did Coach White feel like his team had handled the success of beating Kentucky, getting the extra attention, taking that with him into Oklahoma? He talked about more about that after the game, too.
We'll continue to learn and grow. Our detail wasn't great tonight. Oklahoma missed a few for us. I think they'd probably agree with that. Shoot-around was okay today. So the handling of success from the other day, I thought was good, not great. If you want to be in the upper half of this league, you've got to respond to negativity, as we've talked about, and positivity. And pretty good, but not great. Got to be better there. And so here we go. You beat Oklahoma. What's it going to look like these next few days? Preparing for another big one, another huge challenge. I loved our halftime response, though. I thought we had some really good individual responses as well throughout the game. Played with a lot of toughness, especially defensively down the stretch.
Because of how good the SEC is, how deep this league is, we don't know how this is going to end for Georgia this year, but undoubtedly this is a team that's doing things that that Georgia basketball has not done in years. And if you care about college basketball at all, if you're open to caring about it, it's worth your attention here right now. That they're fun to watch, they're earning big wins, they are interacting with the fans in an awesome way, the students in particular, in these games at Stegman Coliseum. The Georgia basketball is a real thing here right now. Mike White doing a great job. I hope you'll check them out this week as they got some big games coming up. And speaking of next Saturday against Auburn, I'm told that Auburn coach Bruce Pearl going to be with Mike Griffith and Cody Chavin tonight as a part of On the Beat. So check that out this evening, 7 p.m. Mike and Cody with Bruce Pearl will obviously coach against Georgia next Saturday. Let me also take a moment here to, before we get ready to wrap things up, shout out our friends at Daytona Beach, 23 miles of shoreline on the Atlantic coast. Grew up going there. It's a great chance to get away here early 2025. Delicious restaurants, fun outdoor activities like the shopping and the fishing and the golf. You want to go, kayak. There's so many great things to do while you're in Daytona Beach, and great time to take advantage of some great deals, too. Go to DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals, DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals to learn more about that. Plus, a cool thing about this is there's also an international airport. Many of you may not know that, but it is true. International airport right there. So you can fly directly to Daytona Beach, kind of cut down onto that travel time, get you enjoying the beach a little sooner. Our friends at Daytona Beach got that for you there too. So DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals for more on that today. Speaking of the fun that Georgia fans are having, this Georgia basketball team here right now, that's the subject of our golden shoe today here. We'll show you this on the screen from Bill Sanders. It's the famous meme of the guy being distracted by one girl while he's with his current girl. And in this case, it's Georgia fans turning their back on the college football playoffs to say, oh, hello, Georgia basketball. Perhaps that's the case. For a long time, by the way, if you're watching on video, I always thought this was the same girl, that the girl that's mad and the girl that's walking was the same girl. Apparently that's not the case, but for a long time I always thought this was the same girl. But the point is that Bill Sanders says Georgia fans have kind of given up the playoff right now with their excitement towards Georgia basketball. I will say this, in light of the fact that Georgia suffered a disappointing loss, it's good to have a little basketball in our life right now. That has been a welcome addition for me, for sure. We'll give Bill Sanders a golden shoe for that. How about our lousy, stinking Gators and our Gator Hater Updater? Now been 1,528 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. We love giving you a reminder of that. It is our Gator Hater Updater. We hope you all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised. The price is promised. You can trust them on all of that today. For those of you who are watching us on video, which is now pretty much only video, folks, we apologize. We didn't have any kind of pretty pictures for you today. It was a lot of my fat face here today, but we still appreciate you being a part of the show, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. Speaking of conversation, I'll get some of your thoughts here right now. I'll go to DawgNation.com first because I normally start the broadcast in the morning with them. We didn't get a chance to do that today because we were trying to figure some of this kind of stuff out. We appreciate everybody who's working hard to help us out with all of that. Let's get some comments in here right now. Brooke Dog mentioning Oklahoma had some, tough, had kind of a tough shooting night the other night. And some of that I do attribute to the Georgia defense, but also, going on the road in the SEC, not an easy thing to do, even if you're a ranked opponent. I think that's probably true. UGA Marine said the live stream was having some trouble today. I apologize for that. Let's see what else. Johnny Prescott also asking a good question. We're in the day and age in which a lot of Georgia fans seem to want Mike Bobo replaced because they view him not to be a good offensive coordinator. But I do think, as Johnny points out, is Steve Sarkisian still considered to be a play-calling genius after his second down toss sweep at the 1-yard line. And I think there is some element of truth to this, which is play calling is very hard. And I'm not saying this as a way of making excuses for play callers. What I'm saying is that our relationship as sports fans or as like sports talk shows with football play calling is unlike almost anything else in sports. I was thinking about this the other day. The only thing that probably comes close is, if you're a baseball fan, how we judge a manager about when you take out a pitcher or when you choose to leave a pitcher in. That's probably the only thing I can think of in sports that engenders as much second guessing as the play calling stuff sort of seems to create for football. That every football play that doesn't work seems stupid. It just does. It just does. And the response is almost always, well, how could you even think that could work? Like the Sarkisian play, the toss sweep, I think it seems like a really bad idea. I think if Sark were sitting here, he might say, well, this was an Ohio State defense that was like number one in the country in red zone defense that we don't think we can just sort of line it up and sort of go, sort of shoe to shoe and hat to hat and get it in there from the goal line because Ohio State's been stopping people in that instance all season long, he might say. And I would say that those of us who think that was probably a bad play call are probably right, but there's almost always sort of a justifiable reason for any play calling decision, and there's nothing that really creates second guessing more so than football play calling. And when it comes to like replacing an offensive coordinator, like some Georgia fans want to do with Bobo, here are a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, let's just use Todd Monken as an example of this. Like, Todd Monken wouldn't come back to Georgia for any amount of money. He doesn't want to coach college football. Think about a guy like, say, Joe Brady, who had success at LSU, went to the NFL, and listen, this was a guy who, was a head coach, right? He was head coach in Carolina. That didn't go very well. There was a time in which, Brady's NFL coaching future was not really all that secure. But we're led to believe from people close to him that even with that, coming back to college football was not a consideration. That we live in a day and age in which, this idea that you're going to go to the NFL and you're going to find your next offensive play caller the way that Georgia did with Todd Monken. Y'all, that's not happening. That's not happening. They're doing, like Ryan Grubb, Kalen DeBoer's good friend, a chance to be a part of his first staff there at Alabama. But the moment the Seattle Seahawks came calling, Grubb was gone. And, they fire him after just the 1 year. But we don't know that even Ryan Grubb wants to come back to college. That he might, but we don't know that he does, because it seems like most offensive coaches who have a chance to coach in the NFL don't want to even consider coaching in college if that's the chance they have for themselves. Conversely, of guys who do seem to like coaching in college, look at a guy like Kenny Dillingham. Dillingham set a record this year by becoming the first coach born in the 1990s to coach in a bowl game. In other words, this is a very young dude, the sort of guy in that category of coach where you would have thought in the previous era he would be an offensive coordinator for a long time and build a distinguished resume, and then he gets a chance to be a head coach. Not anymore. He has one good year with Dan Lanning at Oregon. Obviously, it had been in Auburn before that. But one good year at Dan Lanning at Oregon, all of a sudden now he's getting the Arizona State job, which is a pretty good job. That's probably a top 30 job in college football, I'd say, top 40 at least. It's a pretty good job, decentish job. And they're hiring, a very young man because that's how in demand, savvy offensive minds are. They become head coaches pretty quick. So people kind of gravitate towards Buster Faulkner. It's like, even if you could hire Buster Faulkner, you get him for like a year, because much like Kenny Dillingham before him and other, guys here too, the odds are, I would say someone like Faulkner's probably well on his way to being a head coach sooner rather than later. So in any discussion about, well, I'm not happy with so-and-so and he needs to be replaced, just keep in mind the pool of possible replacements, or let me try to speak English. The pool of possible replacements is not as deep as maybe many assume. Yard Dog mentioning, NFL assistants wanting to steer clear of college football. There is no doubt that's happening. That is not a myth. That is not a moral panic or anything like that. There is a huge number of qualified coaches who would not consider coaching in college football right now. There is a brain drain from this sport. Not for everybody. For instance, we're led to believe that Glenn Schumann 2 seasons ago turned down the Philadelphia Eagles defensive coordinator job to stay at Georgia. So not everybody is looking to get out of college football, but plenty of people are. And it's not just the top end, right? It's not just the college coaches going to the NFL. At the bottom end of that, you can think of a handful of guys who had on-field coaching jobs like the Group of 5 level. They've taken high school positions, or they were analysts working. I'm in the state of Georgia alone, I'm thinking about here. Analysts kind of working their way up towards getting an on-field coaching job. But once the good Georgia high school job came open, you have a chance to make $100,000 a year, good salaries, in some cases pushing towards 200, but at least $100,000. Guys are taking that. You see the brain drain at both ends, at both the top of the coaching profession in college and kind of the lower end of the hierarchy where, all of a sudden the other level of the sport, depending on which end of the spectrum you're on, suddenly seems a little bit more attractive. Let me go to YouTube for a moment. RR says, I know I have a lot of second guessing or, Monday morning quarterbacking on Mike Bobo, but I've seen the same thing for years with his coaching. So, I really do want to be respectful of people who feel the way that RR does right there, because a lot of people feel that way. What I'm going to tell you is I don't think you have as much statistical evidence to back up that point as you might think. I really don't. Like the Georgia offense this year was not an elite group, but it was last year. I mean, it was. It's 40 points per game. Beck was among the nation's best passers. Like that was an elite offense. It just was. So, on the basis of 2 years on the job, one was elite, one was not, that somehow that's a fireable offense when the non-elite offensive year also happened to be a season in which Georgia won the SEC and made the college football playoff. Like, I'm just not going to be able to match that intensity, and nor do I think anyone should. And I don't want to relitigate all of the, the previous, era, the previous era, for Bobo at Georgia. But I would say go back and look at the 2014 offense. Well, I'm not disrespecting anybody, but like Hudson Mason was the starting quarterback. That was not an NFL quarterback, really. I mean, a guy, I guess, had, some time in the NFL, but that's not an NFL-level quarterback, the likes of which that Georgia has kind of had in recent years. And yet, statistically, they were still, pretty amazing. And that's post-Aaron Murray. Like the Murray years, the Georgia offense, really pretty good. You look at, some of what prevented Georgia winning a national championship. I think you have a hard time tracing that back to Mike Bobo. In fact, I think you see a lot of sort of games which Georgia scored a lot of points, but the opponent just somehow scored more. So I don't dispute that this group this year, this unit this year for Georgia is not very good. I do think I have a little bit of a different interpretation of the past, and I do believe that those who kind of want to condemn Bobo for his previous era here don't probably have as much evidence on their side as sometimes they think they do. Jerry Dog fan asking about Jeremy Pruitt. Obviously, Pruitt's got a long show cause. I think he got we sort of thought this was unfair at the time, and Pruitt's not our favorite guy necessarily because of how he allegedly treated Mark Richt, but we thought that Pruitt got just crazy unfair treatment in terms of how the Tennessee thing played out. I think he got like an 8. Am I right about this? It's like an 8-year show cause. It's really, really long. Pruitt also does not have a history of working well with others always. So I don't know how many teams on the other side of this show cause are going to be jumping in line to hire Jeremy Pruitt. Perhaps they might, but I don't know. TJ Smith pointing out that if you take away the drops for Georgia, that the overall offensive performance for UGA would have looked much better for Beck's individual numbers, but Bobo's collective offense numbers. And for the most part, it's pretty true. That's pretty simple. Now, I also think in some form or fashion, the complete inability to run the ball at all, I think has got to – some of that probably goes to Bobo. It just sort of has to, right? But it's also fair that, leading the nation in drops is no small thing. And you're probably talking about an additional 700 yards of offense, that probably got lost by drops alone. Or even if you cut that number in half and say, well, what if you only had half as many drops? That's still almost another, and not even almost, more than a full game's worth of offensive production that you could have, added back into the overall pie. Jonathan Aaron says, I don't have a problem with Bobo as of right now, but for the people who are calling for him to lose his job, my question is, who would you replace him with? Let's be realistic, and not many better around. Yeah, I would say the most realistic name that people would gravitate towards is Buster Faulkner. That's probably the name that you hear people say the most, and I do think that Buster Faulkner is a really good play caller. I don't dispute that at all. He seems like a pretty smart guy. And Georgia did, I think, a really good job, because when Faulkner came here, people don't really remember this. Faulkner was the offensive coordinator at Southern Miss. That program was a mess at the time. I mean, an absolute mess at the time. So Faulkner left a coaching job to come be an analyst at Georgia. That's the kind of thing that's pretty weird. That doesn't happen very much, but it did. Faulkner left Southern Miss, came to Georgia, became an analyst, and so pretty clearly Georgia identified a pretty sharp coaching mind that was up and coming in the Group of Five ranks. He had been, I want to say, he'd been offensive coordinator at Middle Tennessee State before going to Southern Miss, I believe. So pretty good offensive, track record. Came here as an analyst. People seem to like him right away. He's done really good things at Tech, not elite talent, but the offense has been pretty good. So I think Faulkner is a pretty good offensive coordinator. I think two things, though. A, as I said before, I heard 2 years ago that Faulkner was getting close to getting a head coaching job, maybe, or at least interviewing for one. Or not even, more than interviewing for one, fairly closely connected to one in a way that people weren't aware of. That even after the 2023 season, there was some talk that, he was getting close to becoming head coach somewhere. I won't pretend to know if that's true or not. It's just what I'd heard. So he's likely to be a head coach here very soon. So even if you did, move heaven and earth to bring him in here, that's like a 1-year fix maybe at most, because a guy like that's probably going to get hired as a head coach. But here's the other thing. Whether Faulkner's a good offensive coordinator or not, the thing you got to make peace with is that's not who Kirby Smart wants to work with. Kirby Smart wants to work with Mike Bobo. And that may frustrate you a little bit. That may make Kirby Smart seem a little stubborn or something like that. But gosh, if you, after winning and this may sound trite, it may sound naive, but I think it's still true, that after winning 2 national championships, if you haven't earned the right to pick the offensive coordinator you want to work with, then really and truly, what's the point of winning? If the only thing that winning does is stave off misery, then who would sign up for that long term? I'm not trying to be fatalistic, or I'm not trying to manipulate you, but there are a lot of Georgia fans who kind of hope that Kirby Smart hangs around coaches for a while. And there's open speculation of how long he might actually do that for whatever reason. It's like, if on the one hand you want Kirby Smart to coach for a while, you got to sometimes, on the heels of success, give him the freedom to kind of do it his way. Now, if next season the results aren't better, then I would say the conversation is a little bit different. I really do. But the idea that Kirby Smart hasn't earned a little bit of a grace period, good luck finding anybody to want to coach for you if there's just no grace extended ever, and it's either national championship or somebody's got to be fired. Good luck getting anybody to want to work under those conditions. Julie C. says, let's say that Bobo and Smart were not friends, would they still be saying the same thing? I'm assuming a big part of why Mike Bobo is here is because he and Kirby Smart are close friends. Now, I would say that Mike Bobo has also got a resume that's equal to the job, but the friendship probably is a part of that. But if you like Kirby Smart, don't you want to let him coach with some of his friends here for a little bit? Don't you want to let him try to bank a couple of easy years? Now, he would say this year was the hardest coaching year of his life, so maybe it's not working. But once again, a lot of this doesn't come down to how you evaluate Mike Bobo. A lot of this comes down to how you evaluate Kirby Smart. And if you think he's a good coach, and if you think that if you value the success that he's brought to Georgia, what do you think he ought to be able to do with that success? Should he get to choose to work with people for whatever reason he wants to? And this is not, I would say, because we see some examples of some really bad decisions. Bobby Bowden bringing in Jeff Bowden. That's that his son is offensive coordinator. That appeared to be essentially a decision where you're simply making that choice on the basis of being your son, and clearly not equal to the job. Look at some of Bill Belichick's offensive coordinator hires. Didn't he move the defensive coordinator and make him the offensive coordinator late in his tenure there at New England? I'm not even 100% sure. We see coaches make crazy coordinator hires all the time, But when you look at Mike Bobo's track record, the jobs that he's had, the resume he's put together, I mean, it's certainly not a resume that's beneath the standard of Georgia. It's not. But why he's here as opposed to being somewhere else probably does have to do with the friendship, at least in some measure, to the friendship that he and Kirby have, the same way that Will Muschamp. I mean, how many programs do you think Will Muschamp would choose to be an analyst for a couple $100,000 a year, maybe even less than that now? How many programs do you think Muschamp would choose to be an analyst for? Probably not very many, if any at all, but he'll do that here because he and Kirby are friends, that people leverage their social relationships. But after the success that Kirby has enjoyed, has he earned the right to give a friend a chance? I would say that he probably has. And if it doesn't work out in 2025, well, at that point in time, it's probably a different conversation. Weed guy Mike says, if I was a coach, I'd probably hire some of my buddies too, to be honest. Seems like an incredibly stressful job. Probably helps a lot to have built-in chemistry with with your coordinators. Yeah, I mean, yeah, especially the time in which the sport's just getting really, really hard. Now, once again, you can, if you want to make the case, well, hey, Kirby brought in Bobo to make it easier, and it's not like it's actually not any easier on Kirby because he did say in New Orleans, I think it was in New Orleans, this is the hardest coaching year he's ever had. So, I mean, you can make a case that the attempt to make this easier for him has actually not worked out all that well, that he's still just as stressed out as he ever would be. But given the challenge of transfer, challenge of NIL, challenge of just a really competitive SEC, given all of that, you can make the case that wanting to have some assistant coaches that you know and trust to sort of weather all of this, that's not necessarily a bad decision. And to me, the most self-preserving feeling that Georgia fans could have is I think you want to – I mean, I'm not trying to like emotionally manipulate. I'm really not because, I mean, as I've tried to point out today, if you're critical of the Georgia offense, I think you have reason to be critical of it. I think you have some stats to back you up right now. But even with that, and even with the offensive struggles that Georgia had kind of pre-Brock Bowers, I think you still want to try to keep Kirby Smart happy and employed as long as you can. And I'm not here on his behalf to say, well, if you make him mad, he's going to leave. I'm really not saying that. But he's not going to coach here forever. And I don't know. I mean, I could say a lot more about this. I don't want to. I just think that given the success that he's had and the fact that arguably that success still continues, this was an SEC championship year. I don't think we were to a point where, we're at a, I just think that if Kirby Smart wants to sort of keep the status quo with his coordinators for at least another year, I think he's earned the right to do that based on the success that he's enjoyed. Let me go to Facebook for a moment because I haven't been to Facebook yet. And after that, we got to go. See what people are saying over there. Did not intend to go quite as long today, but like I said before, like a lot of y'all feel passionately in a way that's different than I do. Hopefully, at the very least, you'll respect the fact that I'm trying to give you a platform for your opinions. Wayne Kirkland says there's a reason that Kirby Smart makes the salary he makes. And obviously, salary is a big part of this. But I'm telling you right now, and a lot of you know what I'm talking about here, even though none of us have $100 million, at least most of us don't. Maybe some of y'all do. Maybe some of y'all have $100 million. Most of you don't. I certainly will never even come close to that. But I think the one thing we do have some interpretation of is that as we've advanced in our careers and maybe made a little bit more money, what you realize is that there are things that impact the quality of your life far more so than money does. In other words, when Kirby finally does sort of tire of all this, assuming that ever happens, it's not like George would be able to go to him and say, okay, well, how about we double your salary? There comes a point in which you've already got more money you can spend. That quality of life is actually sort of dictated by, do you have the freedom to make the personnel decisions you want to make? And do you have people constantly like looking over your shoulder? Now, it is a results business, and you don't get to go forever with less than stellar results given how competitive the football landscape is right now. You don't get to do that. But, you know, I don't know. I mean, to me, in 2023, Georgia lost one game by 3 points. I think they still should have been in the playoff last year. This year, they lost 3 times, but they still won the SEC championship. Like, I just don't view that as a disaster. Now, maybe I'm just not as competitive as some of you are, but honestly, like, my own personal competitive spirit is not satiated by what somebody else does. You know, like, Georgia winning or losing doesn't make me successful. It makes me happy, but it doesn't make me successful. It's my own achievements or lack of achievement that sort of speaks to my own competitive drive, my own success, things like that. Maybe a different topic for a different day. But given what Georgia's done, even in the 2 years since the 2 national championship years, has Kirby Smart earned the right to sort of still do this thing his way for a little while longer? I would suggest that he probably has. Lucy Bowers-Boykin says, I would give Bobo one more chance if we got rid of Searles. Yeah, so, I mean, obviously I've said before that I'm not happy with the performance of the Georgia offensive line, and I don't know that I could sit here and offer as well-reasoned a defense for Searles as I could for Bobo. I think there's a lot of facts that if you sort of call them Bobo haters, I think there are a lot of facts that the Bobo haters sometimes choose to ignore. And I think it becomes a little bit easy for someone to offer defense of Bobo because of the facts that sometimes get ignored. I don't think it's quite as easy to defend Stacey Searles if I'm being honest. Curtis Cruz says, thank goodness for the hardwood dogs, a much needed distraction from football. I am enjoying having this basketball team in my life right now. I am. Joseph Kennedy says, when you're 102nd in rushing, you should fire some people. I mean, it's certainly not good. It's certainly not good. But even with that, though, Joseph, I mean, it kind of comes down to, I mean, like, clearly that's got to improve. But I think just the question you got to ask is, like, so it's either a national championship level season or someone's got to get fired. And that's going to be the truth every year. Because if so, you know, good luck getting people to want to work here. Like, what is the point of winning if winning doesn't buy you some quality of life? Like, if the only thing winning does is stave off misery in the year that you won, then how long would anybody want to be a part of that? Like, I'm not even sure that's healthy for all of us, because if you don't win at a championship level, there's always going to be a reason that you didn't. And I agree with you. The overall rushing performance from Georgia this year was abysmal. And it's got to be improved. And if Stacey Searles is not back coaching at Georgia next year, I don't think any of us would be shocked by that. I don't think any of us, well, I wonder what happened there. Well, I think the results speak for themselves. And frankly, even if Mike Bobo didn't return in 2025, it's not like, you know, we'd be blown away and shocked just given the fact that this wasn't a great year for the Georgia offense. But if all of the staff did come back intact, I'd tell you, even with some pretty meager stats, and in the case of the rushing offense, downright abysmal stats, I'd say at least for 2025, Kirby Smart ought to have earned the right to do it his way. Just the way that I feel. I honestly realize that many of you don't feel that way. And so that's why I try to give you the platform to say all this. Jacob O'Neill says, I'm not going to tell us what we want to hear on this. You know, I do think it's okay that sometimes we don't have the same point of view. I do think that's okay. I'm not afraid of the fact that many of you don't agree with me on this, and I'm trying to be respectful to all of you as I sort of share some disagreement. Matt Rugavina says that I made a straw man argument. I'm not sure which argument that was. He says our offense was abysmal across the board. We have a right to be concerned. As I said during the regular show, I am concerned. And I thought that Jon Stinchcomb said this really well when I asked him, hey, how optimistic are you that it'll be better in 2025? And he said, I'm not. And I think I'm probably more optimistic than John is, but I can't guarantee it'll be better next year. It really might not be. It might not be. And if it's not, then at that point in time, you got to have some real big boy conversations. You do. And all of a sudden, the prestige of 2 national championships, it doesn't ring the same way 3 years later as it does 2 years later. And it's certainly not the way that it does 1 year later. All of a sudden, now it sort of starts to feel like the past a little bit. I don't dispute all of that. So if you're concerned, I would say if you're concerned about the Georgia offense, I am in the same category as you. I am. But I do think the biggest issue for Georgia, based on the way the offense played this year, was the overall talent level in that offense. And I do think they've taken strides to try to improve that. So James Crump says, I believe fans feel differently now because of how quickly the championship window can close with collectives in the transfer portal and things like that. I respect that. It's certainly noticeable how much Georgia's having to sort of fight battles on so many different fronts within the SEC, outside the SEC. I get all of that. I do. But when you look at other programs that have also had great success, it's not like it was always a smooth ride. I mean, make the comparison to Alabama here for a moment. Alabama lost in the national semifinals as a very big favorite in 2014. They, won the championship the following year. The next year they lost to Clemson. In 2017, they won it again. In 2018, they got blown out by Clemson. In 2019, they didn't make the playoff at all. That even for organizations that have had almost unprecedented success, also in the midst of that unprecedented success, there were moments in which there was year-to-year regression. Like this is what and we're going to close the show after this. This is what some of the national media types are trying to do. They're trying to say that Georgia losing to Notre Dame proves that Georgia and the SEC is no different than all the other leagues. But we would say that just doesn't make a ton of sense, that something that was perhaps proven over the course of years, Georgia with that long streak of dominating non-conference opponents, can somehow be disproven by one game. That's silly to me, whether it's made by a national media member or that argument's made by a Georgia fan. The loss to Notre Dame, a game in which Georgia only scored 10 points, is a concerning data point. But I'm not going to make it much more than that right now, because this may end up being the same blip on the radar for Georgia that a couple of national championship losses to Clemson were for Alabama. It might. Now, it may not. We may look back on it and say that was the start of a troubling trend for Georgia. We may say that. But that game against Notre Dame in and of itself doesn't really prove necessarily anything. How Georgia responds to it one way or another, that'll be the proof. So we got to go for now. Long show, long comments here. So let me wrap up here. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. Obviously, with the water, cold weather, sometimes the water pipes burst. You've had that issue before if you don't leave your water dripping, things like that. And perhaps for you, that creates a plumbing emergency. Well, if you have any kind of plumbing emergency at all, let our friends at RS Andrews show up and handle a plumbing emergency like that for you. You can find them online, rsandrews.com. That is rsandrews.com. A great resource for any of your plumbing emergency needs. All right, we're going to say goodbye for now. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.